Good evening. No. Good evening, and welcome. It's my great pleasure to be here with you. I'm Ken Brecker, the president of the Library Foundation of Los Angeles. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you. We're very grateful to the Hollywood Foreign Press Association. They've really helped us understand the importance of film in our society and the importance of journalism. And I'd like I couldn't help but thinking today, since so many librarians came up to me and said, "Is he really coming? Is he really coming?" I said, "Yes, Lester will be here." There are so many similarities between journalists and librarians. They're both protectors of truth and history. They're both dedicated to framing the important questions of our time. They're both dedicated to amplifying voices that might not be heard. And libraries, as I think you all know, welcome everyone. And we never tell people... We never tell people what to think. We never tell people who to vote for. But we do something else. And there's a wonderful service provided by this library called Info Now. And you can call that number anytime and say, "I have a question and I'm puzzled. This is something I just saw or something I've just read. Can you help me get to the truth?" And I love being in the room. The questions are incredible. And they're ones that you can expect intelligent, smart, caring people to be asking at this moment about our country, about our democracy, about the state of affairs. And I heard a librarian say the other day, "That's a wonderful question. And if you'll read the Los Angeles Times on page 5, I think you can find the answer to that one." And so it's a great pleasure to introduce to you Norman Pearlstein, the executive editor of the Los Angeles Times. His distinguished career includes being the Wall Street Journal's first managing editor in Asia, based in Hong Kong. He then returned to New York as managing editor and then executive editor of the Wall Street Journal. And then between 1995 and 2005, he served as editor-in-chief of Time Warner and Time Inc. And in those capacities, he oversaw the editorial content of 154 magazines, including Entertainment Weekly, Fortune, InStyle, Money, People, Real Simple, Sports Illustrated, and Time. He joined Bloomberg in 2008 as their chief content officer and subsequently took on the additional role as chairman of Bloomberg Businessweek in New York and Bloomberg Government in Washington. He is the author of a book we should all be reading called Off the Record: The Press, the Government, and the War Over Anonymous Sources. He is the recipient of numerous honors, including the American Society of Magazine Editors Hall of Fame, the Gerald Loeb Lifetime Achievement Award for Distinguished Business and Financial Journalism, and the National Press Association's Editor of the Year Award. To introduce the panel tonight, it is my great pleasure to introduce a truly distinguished journalist and a man of courage and never failing integrity, Norman Pearlstein.
Thank you so much, Ken. Well, thank you so much, Ken, and I apologize for the length of the introduction. I tried to censor him, but as I learned in the years when I served on Ken's board at the Sundance Institute, where as board members, he told us what he had done rather than ask us what he should do. We're usually in good hands if we just let Ken do what he wants to do, and I think what he's done with the Library Foundation has been extraordinary, and that all of us in Los Angeles are beneficiaries of all of that hard work. As much as I've known Ken from those days at Sundance, the truth is we were born in the same hospital on the same day and separated at birth. We continue to find ways to do things together. So it's a pleasure to be here this evening and to welcome all of you to LA Press Freedom Week, a series of events throughout the city celebrating press freedom independent journalism and the First Amendment. This is one of 3 marquee panels looking at key issues. Monday, we discussed press freedom and elections. Today, we shall look at press freedom and diversity. And tomorrow at UCLA Law School, leading scholars and advocates will look at legal threats. There are numerous other events as well. For example, tomorrow, the Los Angeles Times will work with our good friends and colleagues at KPCC in Pasadena on a panel about important legislative reforms in California that enabled journalists to lift the veil of secrecy around police records. That has been an ongoing and important series of stories that resulted from that. Press Freedom Week came about in response to the generosity of the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, which, under the leadership of its chair and former president, Mayor Tatna, has really emerged as one of the organizations that is most supportive of press freedom in this country. It has made significant $1 million contributions to the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, Inside Climate News, and most importantly, the Committee to Protect Journalists, of which I am a board member. The Los Angeles Times is proud to partner with HFPA in bringing this important issue to the Los Angeles public, and Sam Assey from HFPA will say a few words at the close of this event. Press freedom, I often think, it should go without saying how important it is, but I do find myself almost every day having to say how important it is, especially in the environment we live in, and with leaders like Joel Simon, the executive director of CPJ, and Kathleen Connor, the chair. CPJ has been in the forefront of really defending the press around the world, and increasingly it has to spend some of its resources also thinking about press freedom here at home. The panel tonight is looking at a very complex issue that not only goes to the heart of divisions within our society, but also about how stories are told and what it means to have the power of the press. And that is why press freedom and diversity is such an important topic. We fight for press freedom because we believe that the greatest possible variety of voices and perspectives must be heard through to the media, and those voices must reach the widest possible audience. Only then can citizens in this country and in the countries around the world make informed decisions about the issues that impact their lives. As journalists, we need freedom to do our work, but we also need to look inward and examine the systems and structures we have in place to ensure that we are meeting our mission. Today's panelists, not surprisingly, present diverse perspectives on these issues. Leon Krauze is the anchor here in Los Angeles on Univision's nightly newscast. He's not only delivering the news in Spanish, he's providing a perspective on the news that resonates with the audience. Errin Haines is the national writer on race and ethnicity for the Associated Press, working out of Philadelphia and covering the intersection of race, politics, and the presidential campaign. She draws on her own background and experiences in covering these critical issues. Marina Walker-Guevara is the Director of Strategic Initiatives and Network of ICIJ and the editor of the Panama and Paradise Papers. She believes her model and cross-border collaboration empowers local journalists who know their own countries best and can shape global perceptions more effectively. Finally, my colleague, Sewell Chan, Deputy Managing Editor of News at the Los Angeles Times and the architect of many of the most important initiatives that we have embarked on since the Los Angeles Times was returned to local ownership under Patrick Soon-Shiong and his family, has led Sewell to have an especially important position and is worked very closely with me in making sure that we create a newsroom that reflects the complexity and the diversity of the audiences that we need to serve. I would finally note that in Dr. Soon-Shiong and his wife, Michelle, we are lucky not only to have people who are in love with Los Angeles, who want their legacy to be an institution committed to public service journalism, but reflecting their own upbringing in South Africa under apartheid, where they were non-white. It has been an important issue to them that diversity be at the forefront of everything that we do. So with that, I would like to introduce our panel and, of course, our host for the discussion and moderator, Lester Holt, who is the host of NBC's Nightly News and Dateline NBC. He is a fellow board member of CPJ and one of America's intrepid reporters. If you ever questioned that, I would just say take a look at the most recent series on the criminal justice system and its effect on prisons, and I think you will understand why NBC and all of us are fortunate to have Lester in the position that he's in. So please join me in welcoming the panel and our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you. Very nice introduction. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow.
Well, thank you, everyone. Good evening. A nice crowd. I understand there's plenty of open seats. Maybe not so much. I want to thank Norm for that great introduction. Thanks to the LA Times and the Hollywood Foreign Press Association for serving as sponsors of Press Freedom Week. And thanks you to the Committee to Protect Journalists, of which I serve on the board, also the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, to the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and to the many other partners and groups which have helped to make the first ever LA Press Freedom Week a success and make it possible. So we are happy that you are here to take part in this as well. And today, as Norm mentioned, we're going to tackle a fascinating and certainly a critical issue: how to ensure that news and information, not just in this country but around the world, reflects the diversity of the communities we serve. And you put another way, we're going to look at, who reports the news and for whom, and how the answers to these questions shape our understanding of events in our communities and around the globe. So let me reintroduce to you our panel: Leon Krauze, Errin Haines, Marina Walker, and Sewell Chan. Thank you all for being here. This is a great group. The good news is we had this discussion already backstage, so we're going to try. Bad news is we're going to try and recreate it as best we can. But folks here have a lot to say. We are all of one mind that we are passionate about what we do as journalists. We are defenders of freedom of the press, not only in this country and around the world. And so we want to continue to raise the bar high and keep it high. So thanks, everyone, for taking part. I'm going to drill down on everybody's kind of individual story in a little bit, but I just want to throw out this first question, and feel free to swing away at it. What is diversity in terms of what we as journalists do? I think of diversity as an HR term, but how important is it to our role as reporters?
I think it comes down to whose stories get told and who's telling the stories. And there are many dimensions of that. I think there are increasingly transnational dimensions, which I hope Marina will talk about. There are dimensions about the changes in American society. I think often the US discussion gets framed in those terms because we're talking about diversity of along so many different characteristics now, not only race and ethnicity, but also national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, and also important dimensions like class and military service, people of faith. It turns out that there are a lot of communities that are underrepresented in American newsrooms. And the better we do at representing the complexity and the richness of American society, the more credibility and the more trust we'll gain with our readers and our viewers and our listeners. And I think that's where the connection to press freedom comes in, because the attacks on the press are often framed around assaults on credibility and assaults on trust. And the best way that we can gain, keep, establish, and nurture trust is by reflecting the diversity and richness of the communities that we're trying to cover.
Yeah, and Marina, you were mentioned there. I sound like I'm doing a debate. You were mentioned, you get 30 seconds. No. We were talking debates backstage, so forgive me. But to weigh in on that, follow up, if you will.
Yes, for us investigative reporters, diversity comes down to who gets to ask the tough questions and who gets included in these transnational investigations. Investigative reporting was a lone wolf enterprise forever, and it was the realm of a few privileged, often men, often white, who worked at very powerful media houses, established and wealthy media houses around the world. And they brought amazing stories, world-changing, democracy-changing stories. But the world also changed, became complex, and the stories became complex with the world. And that approach was not sufficient anymore. So what happened is we were missing the big picture. We were all in isolation, pitching, like trying to do little pieces of these complex stories. And that's when things started to change. We realized that, and we started to work in networks. We started to reach out to one another and prepare for this, something like, for example, the Panama Papers. What would have happened if that would have come to an organization who would have tried to do it on its own?
So it gave you a louder voice. It was harder to shoot down that reporting because it came from such a broad place.
It was like it needed that across the world transnational network approach to do justice to the information we had in front of us. So that form of radical sharing allowed also for radical inclusion of newsrooms from across the world of all sizes, and they were all brought together to work as equal partners from Burkina Faso to Chile to Hong Kong to the US to break a story of world importance, a story like that and many others, because this has not been the only important collaborative story, but stories that the world needs to know and that we need to tell them from that perspective and from that approach of collaboration and sharing.
And Errin, we talked the importance of diversity. Are we seeing it in newsrooms? You cover what the intersection of race and politics.
Yeah.
Are we seeing it in the newsrooms?
Yeah, I think that we definitely are, especially in the wake of the 2016 election. I think that what a lot of newsrooms are realizing is that we certainly are not in a post-racial environment, right? If anything, right. Yeah, no, if anything, we're in a hyper-racial environment. And so what that means is to cover politics in America in this moment is to be fluent in issues of race, right? And I think that that's not necessarily something that people who covered politics before necessarily had that fluency, but people who cover race are constantly having to deal with the intersectionality of politics, of business, of education, of sports, you name it. Race intersects with every aspect of American society, and politics is certainly no exception. And so, for me, what's really been important in terms of diversity is to Sewell's point, the visibility and the representation piece, right? Who are we talking about when we talk about rural voters? Who are we talking about when we talk about who's educated? Who's women? You know what I mean? Who are voters of faith? Because usually the default setting is that black and brown people get to be urban and white people get to have all kinds of things that they care about, and we don't necessarily assume that people of color actually have issues that they care about. And so hearing from folks on the issues that look like the people that all of us know is very important to me in my job, and something that I think has become part of the diversity conversation in covering politics today.
Leon, we heard the term transnational a moment ago. Let's talk about, you do a newscast, one of the most popular newscasts in Los Angeles. You're speaking to a Spanish audience, but within that audience, there is an incredible amount of diversity in terms of countries of origin. So how does that, how do you make that work? trying to deal with such a broad audience?
I think that, first of all, you're absolutely right, Lester. I mean, in Los Angeles itself, one would think that the Hispanic community is monolithic. It's anything but monolithic. We have the Guatemalan community, the Salvadorian community, which is the largest community outside El Salvador, and of course the Mexican community. This is the second city when it comes to the number of Mexicans in the world after Mexico City. So what we do is we have reporters who understand the idiosyncrasies of each particular community, and then we try to manufacture an overall journalistic story that encompasses all of them. And I think that's what Univision does as well. If you think with, if you open the scope and look at what we do in Miami, I always find it fascinating that, again, looking at the Hispanic community as monolithic, when you think of what happens in southern Florida and you compare it to what happens in southern California, really both communities couldn't be more different. I mean, we share a language, and in some cases we share religion, but we don't share music. We don't share we drink different drinks. We eat different food, and we have obviously very different origin stories. I mean, the Cuban-American community and the Mexican-American community, the story of how both communities emigrated and have assimilated into the United States is completely different. So I think it's a fascinating challenge as a Hispanic journalist, as I'm sure it is for my colleagues, to try and tell the story of these communities in a faithful and thorough way.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the idea of authenticity. And, you know, to me, that the best research is the stuff you hear people talking about, and they want journalists to connect with the communities they cover. That's very important. And that brings me to something, you do a segment on your program called La Mesa, in which you sit down with average people on the streets of LA. I think you pull out a plastic table and a couple of chairs. If you don't mind, I want to play that for folks, and then I want to ask you about that on the other
Wonderful,
side.
thank you.
And somewhere it's up here. Here it is.
¿Cómo se llama usted?
Mi nombre es María Perdomo. Soy originaria de Pastepec, Chiapas, México.
Cuénteme de su marido. ¿Lo quería usted mucho?
Sí.
¿Y qué pasó?
Él falleció. Tuvo un accidente.
¿Qué edad tenían sus hijos entonces, cuando murió su padre?
El más chiquito tenía 4, la de en medio tenía 7 y la más grande 9.
Y entonces, con hijos chiquitos, usted se dio cuenta que tenía que hacer algo más. El momento en que usted empieza a alejarse de su tierra, ¿se acuerda usted?
Mucho. Tardó mucho tiempo en que yo no podía tragar. Sentía que a mis hijos le hacían falta.
¿Y sus hijos, cuando usted les decía, ya cuando eran más grandes, me tengo que ir de nuevo, qué le decían?
No te vayas.
No querían que usted se fuera. ¿Y cómo le explicaba usted a sus hijos?
Pues me tienen que entender.
Su hija mayor es abogada.
Sí.
¿A usted le da orgullo eso?
Mucho, mucho.
¿Y su hijo pequeño? ¿Qué edad tiene él ahora?
Él tiene 22 años. Actualmente está en la Ciudad de México. Él está estudiando mecatrónica en robot. La última vez que me vine hace 4 años, hicimos un pacto. Yo trabajo y él estudia. Y me lo está cumpliendo.
Todo lo que usted ha hecho, doña Mari, toda esta batalla, ¿ha valido la pena?
Mucho. Porque a pesar de tanto sufrimiento que me ha pasado al ir y venir y el alejamiento de mis hijos, he logrado sacar a mis hijos adelante.
Qué bonita historia.
It's brilliant.
Thank you.
It's an absolutely brilliant reporting device,
Thank you.
and it gets. And I want to kind of create this conversation about this idea of authenticity. You know, we bring diversity to the newsroom, but how that extends not only in the stories, but in the connection with the community. How has that, you know, affected, you know, your perception in this market?
Oh, That's a big question. I mean, when I first arrived in LA to work for Univision, I realized that the community here looks at Univision for information, but also for companionship, guidance, and narrative. So we began this experiment in community-oriented journalism. We placed this table in corners chosen at random all across Southern California. There's no pre-production, no makeup, no tie, no pen even. Nothing like that. I don't know the names of the people I'm interviewing. I just invite them to sit across the table from me, and I begin every interview the same way. What's your name? ¿Cómo se llama usted? And from that point on, people just tell me their life stories. In the beginning, I thought that they would just stand up from the table and refuse to tell me anything. Of course, most of these people are immigrants or sons of immigrants. But what I found was the complete opposite, a willingness to tell their stories, but also to belong. For example, I ask each person to sign with a Sharpie their name on the table, so that it belongs, a gesture of identity, of belonging. And it's part of what makes, honestly, Univision so special, and it has become my life calling. It's the emotional bond that I built with the community, and what I cherish the most about my job in LA.
No, it's great. I want to talk to you all about how do we bring that kind of connection and passion and include our life experiences in reporting without crossing that line into advocacy. Or is it okay to cross that line of advocacy? Errin, let me start with you.
I don't think that life experience or lived experience and advocacy are necessarily synonymous. I think that like life experience, lived experience can inform journalism. I have covered issues of social justice as part of my beat on race. Obviously, race and policing is something that's been in the headlines a lot in recent years. Race and the criminal justice system in general, race and our voting process, right? Like our democratic process. That's an American process, right? But for people in my community, there's a history there. There is a lived experience, that frankly people that I know have been through that qualifies me in a way that it may not qualify somebody who has no familiarity with that experience. Maybe they have some skepticism about how true or how real something like voter suppression still is in 2019. But having known people for whom, not just people who that happened to, when we were under legalized segregation in the country, but people who are still living that experience right now. I am able to say, as a Black woman, that yes, this is something that I am open to believing and open to thinking needs to be reported.
Is that a bias or a sensitivity?
That's news judgment.
Yeah.
That's what it is. Yeah. It's a story.
Yeah, Sewell, you want to weigh in on that? On this notion of that line of bringing your personal experiences, your being, your knowledge, sensitivity?
This is a little bit hard, I think, for people from more traditional journalism backgrounds. The question of, especially in print journalism or working at wire services like Associated Press or Reuters or working at legacy news organizations as I have, I think, people from my generation were trained to think a certain way, that we were really behind the scenes. We weren't like those broadcast journalists who were quasi-public figures. We're a little bit more in the background and shouldn't talk about ourselves. And I think it's evolving. I've had a pretty traditional career in some ways. I don't know that my perspectives as an Asian American, as a New Yorker, as a gay man, as a child of immigrants, I don't know how that directly affected my coverage, for example, of the Federal Reserve. Or my no. But I'm not trying to make a glib point. I'm not trying to make a glib point though, because I think it's actually a mistake. I think probably 10 years ago I thought, oh, it has nothing. It's not connected, but it actually is connected. Mm-hmm. Who gets to tell which stories? Mm-hmm. Stories about communities of color or immigrant communities don't only get to be told by journalists of color or by immigrants. Okay. And similarly, coverage of the G20 summits or hosting a presidential debate doesn't get to only be done by a certain kind of person. And I think, our times are changing and they're prompting us all to reflect a little bit more carefully about, again, who gets to tell this, who gets to be an expert. And I think as long as we go back to the basics of journalism, don't make assumptions, ask questions, precision, accuracy. That's what's actually going to preserve journalistic value. And I also want to say that, the values are, I think the values are enduring, but I think the terminology might be changing a little bit. Some of us are probably from a generation when concepts like, are from a generation that, for which concepts like neutrality and objectivity were very, very much kind of, when I was coming up, it was about being objective. Well, over the last 15, maybe 20 years, the objectivity concept has become a little bit more questioned as people have asked, well, who's really objective? What point of view are you talking about when you're talking about objectivity? Who's objectivity? We're all from somewhere. We all have a background. We all have a family situation or a community that we grew up in, and it's going to affect who we are and the choices we made. So the question isn't, do we come from nowhere? Because there's no one who comes from nowhere.
Right.
The question is, how do we bring where we're from and the perspectives that we have to apply with, impartiality and fairness and expertise and curiosity, the perspectives that we bring to the things that we cover.
Yeah, and Marina, let me ask you about, from the perspective of investigative reporting, is there a line in terms of advocacy and passion and experience?
Of course, as investigative reporters, you don't want to cross a line of advocacy, but we want to think about impact, and we are not under the illusion that we are doing this work, we're going to expose these evils, and then we're going to just step away and wait and see what happens. We want to think about what can change in the world as a result of our journalism, and that's something that maybe a few years ago, or like 20 years ago, it was unthinkable, because we thought even thinking about the possible impact was crossing that line. And today we think about it from the beginning. We don't want to do stories that are vanity. We want to do stories that are going to change something. And on a personal note, talking about authenticity and what we bring and our experience, when I first came to this country from Argentina and I was in journalism school, I remember asking one of my professors, how can I make it in this country? What would you recommend? What's your tip? And I got this response. He said, lose your accent, both in your voice and in your written, what you write and how you speak. And that could have crashed somebody in a career. And thankfully, I had many other professors and mentors who were telling me the opposite. Preserve your voice. And I can say, 20 years later, that my voice is what allowed me to do the kind of stories we do, to think about that cross-cultural sensitivity, to think about not parachuting reporters all over the place, but to really work with the native reporters in each country, because they are the ones that have the access, the community support, the community relations, the knowledge that we need to tell the global stories that we are trying to tell today. So I've learned to own my voice, and I still have my accent.
Bravo. Leon, you wanted to weigh in.
I think your accent is beautiful. And in Spanish, even better. The Argentinian accent is wonderful. I mean, one of the first editors I worked for gave me, what still is to this day the best lesson I've ever learned in journalism, which is when in doubt, go report. When angry, go report. That's what we should do. I mean, I used to teach at USC fairly recently, and I remember telling my students, I can't remember an occasion, a moment in which an opinion has brought down a government or a corrupt politician. And of course, reporting has, right? Even Walter Cronkite went to Vietnam and then gave his journalistically informed opinion on what was going on over there. When it comes to activism versus journalism, I go back to that advice and to one of my journalistic heroes, the Nobel Prize winner, Svetlana Alexievich, that has, with her work, and her work is basically just listen to people and tell their stories almost in the first person. And for example, what she did with Chernobyl is the basis for the wonderful show that we have seen now, but her book on Chernobyl, and it's just the voices of the people affected by the explosion, by the scandal. And that's journalism in its purest form.
Yeah, and I was just going to add to that. I mean, it's just so important for us as journalists, I mean, even if diversity is maybe an emotional issue for folks, or something that they may see diversity as some sort of objectivity issue. At our core as journalists, what is it that we're trying to do? We're trying to be honest, we're trying to be accurate. we have to tell the truth about where we are in this country. And journalism at its best is telling people who and what we are as a country at any given moment, right? And so, I mean, we're not afflicting the comfortable because, you know, it's maybe somebody that looks like us whose feelings we don't want to hurt, or, you know, maybe it would offend somebody to say, like, that's not, that is diminishing the job, you know, for us to do that.
I want to ask you, I read something you did about covering the race beat.
Yeah.
And you talk a lot about politics, this intersection of race and politics, and that race is going to be a defining issue in the 2020 elections. You want to expand on that a little bit?
Well,
no, in our next hour. Yeah.
and I know, I mean, as political journalists, like we say all the time, like, this is the most consequential election of our time. Every 4 years, it's the most consequential election of our time. But I mean, I'm not even being hyperbolic. Like, it is. This is important. You know, this matters, and we are, in a lot of ways, really at a defining moment in this country, and not even necessarily about the voter. I mean, about the candidates, but about the voters, who we are as citizens, neighbors, friends, family members. Like, that is all on the table headed into 2020, and race is a huge part of that, because I think that what we learned coming out of 2016 is that a lot of folks came out feeling like they didn't know each other. Feeling like they you know, coworkers or their kids, friends, parents, or people they went to church with were people that they didn't know, you know. And so, as journalists, just as these candidates are going out and meeting voters and getting to know them, journalists have to be doing the same right now.
So this gets us to the point. I don't want to turn this into a political discussion, but it gets us to the point of there were critics who said we didn't listen, we didn't understand the mood of the electorate in 2016, and I want to state that to ask the question, were we as not diverse as we thought we were in terms of political diversity, in terms of regional diversity, and the other things that make us different?
Well, I think what we know is that you can be diverse and be segregated at the same time. This is a very diverse country. It's also a very segregated country. And so, you know, when folks are maybe working together under the same roof, or going to school together under the same roof, but then going back to their own communities, how well are they actually getting to know each other, even though we are diverse? I mean, cities are very diverse, but, you know, where are people living? We know that. We know that is the case, that folks are living in different pockets of town and not necessarily getting to know each other on that really kind of neighborhood level.
Let me bring in Sewell. Are we missing something, though, in this fabric of diversity? Are there patches that are missing?
There absolutely are, and I would say the rural-urban divide, which is perhaps one of the most salient divisions in American politics, is one of them, right? And you know, the critiques have to be, if we're being introspective, as I think we need to be, and if we're being empathetic, as we need to be as journalists, we need to plead guilty to some of the accusations, right? I sometimes joke that I'm moving from New York to Los Angeles. I may have just exchanged one blue urban bubble for another. But the truth is that we all have our own bubbles. And, you know, again, I want to just broaden the diversity conversation as much as possible. It is very dangerous if journalism gets defined as a set of fact-based, okay, it's very dangerous if reporting gets defined as something that gets done on the coasts. It's something that gets done in big cities by people who went to good schools. And frankly, those people increasingly may look more and more diverse, but if we all went to the same schools and same sets of social circles and have the same cosmopolitan sensibilities, we're going to be missing out on part of what is the richness and complexity of America.
Absolutely.
We may be missing out on what's going on in the upper Midwest or in parts of the American South. And it's not our fault that NBC News isn't based in Detroit. There are obviously reasons why New York and Los Angeles are such powerful media capitals and why there's so many political journalists in Washington. That's not going to be changed over, why so many tech journalists are in San Francisco. That's not going to change overnight. But what we do need to do is make sure that we're seeing the richness of America for what it is, that we're representing the communities across America of different, you know, shapes, sizes, you know, the fabric. And, you know, that's, it's one of the beefs I have sometimes with the 50-state, you know, blue and red map, because the truth is that there are red communities and red swaths in blue states.
Absolutely.
And there are also many blue dots in red states. And we have to look at the patterns, the county by county, the variations, and take a more nuanced look at what it means to cover politics in America now.
Marina, you originally, please.
I just wanted to add that we need to also remember the hundreds of cities and towns that have become news deserts in this country.
Absolutely.
We are experiencing a huge crisis in the media business model, and that means that those communities have lost their newspaper, they have lost that connection, what Leo does, that ability to know a journalist, to have a personal relationship, to be able to go to the newspaper and see it for an event, for a community conversation, for the town hall, doesn't exist. And so when we think, and I don't want to introduce another huge topic, but when we think about misinformation and we are quick to blame the perpetrators, of course we should, and I like also to be introspective and to think, where were journalists? What was, when that was happening, when that misinformation was spreading and increasingly and continues to spread, it happens to be more acute in large swaths of the country where there are no established newspapers, magazine, weeklies, where that connection with journalists has been lost. So perhaps the misinformation problem is also a journalism engagement problem.
You want to weigh into that, Leo?
Yeah, I mean, just quickly. During the last Republican convention in Cleveland, we were staying in this horrible hotel. Local news people. So yes, an extended stay hotel that was probably, I would imagine, like 20 miles east of Cleveland. And all of the teams of journalists that were there, in the morning, we got in our cars and we drove west towards the city. Instead of driving east towards western Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio, those counties where the number of jobs lost since 2000 was just mind-boggling. There still isn't any opportunity for most of those counties to get back the number of jobs they lost in the 21st century. And I remember when the results of the election came in, after crying for 3 hours, I emerged from my office. and frankly, I remember thinking, we should have turned east instead of west and listened to the people in those counties, at least one day, before going into the circus of the convention, which is super fun for me, like the Super Bowl. We should have done that, and we didn't. And I still, as a local news anchor from LA and a Washington Post columnist, which I wasn't back then, but I am now, working for a Mexican newspaper back then, I still kick myself for not doing that.
Well, and Lester, I know you said this is not a political panel, but Lester's wound us up.
I guess it is now.
Here we go. No, I mean, I have a similar story. The day after the election, I got dispatched to a western Pennsylvania county that had gone for Obama in 2008 and 2012, but had totally flipped for Trump. And so, you know, my job was to go up there and find out what happened. And I get up there, and I'm driving around, and I remember being astonished at just how, you know, because I've covered several presidential cycles at this point. You know, you go to a neighborhood, you see yard signs everywhere. You know what people are thinking, or you know which side people are on. I didn't see any yard signs in this county until I get to this one house that is festooned. Red, white, and blue, Trump, everything. And I said, well, might as well start here. At least I know what I'm getting, you know, if we stop here. Plus, it was great for photos, and I had the photographer with me, so it was like jackpot, right? So, you know, we knock on the door, and the woman comes out, and she's like, where y'all been? I could have told you last summer what was going to happen.
Exactly.
If you had come up here last summer, if you would come up here during the primary when people were crossing over to vote for Trump, I could have told you then what was going to happen.
But see, that goes back to my earlier question. Does that mean that we're not as diverse, that those ideas were not being voiced in newsrooms because those people didn't exist in newsrooms?
Maybe.
Maybe, but I think Marina made a really good point. I mean, like, the news deserts, they're not just a problem for those communities. They are a problem for those of us who are covering politics. I know when I'm going to Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Texas, like, it is so important to me to be able to get the pulse of what is going on the ground, reading what people are, you know, back when newspapers were still doing local polls, right? Like, maybe they weren't necessarily scientific or something that we could use, but they were helpful to give you a window into what the electorate was doing in those crucial places, reading the letters to the editor that people would write in those places. That tells you what people care about. We don't know what they care about because we don't live there. You know what I mean? So to have that, I think that reporting from the coast, it just means that we miss a lot of that. And going, to Leon's point, going to places and following a candidate and then leaving without really having any sense of what that place is. And I know that, you know, with the constraints of our business now, we don't necessarily always have the time to do that. But when we do, and to the extent that we do, it only informs our journalism.
Let me broaden out the discussion a little bit, if I can bring Marina back into it. You're originally from Argentina, as you pointed out. When you look at the way U.S. media covers the world, what, in your opinion, is missing?
On one hand, I have always admired the tradition of investigative reporting in America, and that's why I came here in the U.S. I came following a tradition of the muckrakers, you know, the ones that were digging out the hard stories, the Watergate, and the freedom of information laws that we don't have in my country. So all of that was incredibly attractive to me, and those are still precious things that you have in your system and that need to be defended because we cannot take them for granted anymore, as you know.
Absolutely.
And what worries me now is the kind of signal that our leadership in this country is giving to countries like mine, Argentina, polarized societies that used to look up to the U.S. in terms of independence, in terms of the strength of the institutions, and the defense of freedom of the press. And right now, it's kind of like the opposite. It's like the U.S. from, you know, at the very top is signaling to despots and to populists and to dictators that it's okay to go after journalists, that they are the enemy of the people, that they are despicable. And you know, that's enough. Those words matter in countries around the world. In Azerbaijan, where we're working with a member, one of our members of our network, who has been imprisoned repeatedly by the regime. Those words matter in countries like Greece, where it's a crime to report who owns a company. It matters in countries like Venezuela today, where there's almost any independent media left. Those are huge words, and it's making our work only so much harder.
And Leon, you're from Mexico, a country where journalists are regularly murdered with impunity. Violent attacks, thankfully, against journalists in the United States are something rare, but there are growing concerns about the press freedom environment here, notably as a result of President Trump's anti-media rhetoric. Are there lessons that you have learned as a Mexican journalist that are relevant to your work, our work in this country?
Well, the first thing I would like to say is that I do agree that the message that the man in power sends all across the world is a negative one when it comes to the work of journalists and freedom of the press. But I really admire what the American press, my colleagues, have done as a reaction to Trump. The way that the Washington Post reacted, the way that the New York Times has reacted, the LA Times as well, the coverage of the Times, for example, the LA Times, on the issue of immigration is simply brilliant. The way the LA Times has been covering Mexico is also brilliant. What's been happening in the border with the community of the people who have been sent back to Mexico to wait out their asylum process, a process that can take longer than I don't know, a year and a half in some cases. The reporters that Sewell's working with are brilliant. So one of the reasons why I'm optimistic about the future of the United States, there are many, and I could go through them. One of them certainly is the independence and the strength of the press. Mexican press, and I think Latin American press in general, but the Mexican press has never been as independent. And whenever someone from power has decided to really censor or pressure journalists, they have been very successful. And that's what's been happening in Mexico lately. Our current president is very much like Trump in many ways. I actually interviewed him a couple of years ago, and I asked him, have you noticed similarities between you and Trump? I mean, you saw the campaign, and I mean, do you notice any similarities? And he looked at me and said, well, you know, he has less political experience. And that's about, I mean, and he's right. They're very similar, and López Obrador is more experienced, so he's more dangerous. To answer your question, I think that the courage of journalists in peril in Mexico, in regions that are particularly dangerous, is incredibly admirable. And but quite frankly, I also see this with my American colleagues. Even when it comes to immigration, the work that people like Jonathan Blitzer in The New Yorker has been doing, Jacob Soboroff, your colleague in MSNBC and NBC, the way he has been covering immigration, you can find that courage too. The only thing I would ask is for the American press to keep an eye on countries like Mexico, so that we can help my colleagues, our colleagues in Mexico, remain free and independent from power that's going to be increasingly tyrannical, sadly.
I appreciate the fact that you listed off all the great work being done by a lot of our colleagues, and not to be navel-gazing here, but let me throw this out. Are we going to look back, and is this going to be one of the finest hours for American journalism? We're so focused right now on the criticism sometimes, but shoving that aside, are we going to look back and this is as a potential good moment?
Well, I don't know about good or bad. I feel like we really are potentially in a golden age of journalism, just because there is so much happening, not just in our country, but around the world. And, you know, I think that there are a lot of people, certainly people of our generation, who maybe didn't live through, like, the civil rights movement, for example, or the women's movement, or like some other major milestone movement in this country. And you used to speculate, well, what would I have done, if I had been alive then, and if I had been a journalist then, like, what would I have done? We don't have to ask ourselves that now. Like, what are you going to do now? Like, we are at an inflection point in this country on so many issues. And so, as a journalist, there is an opportunity to rise to the occasion. I tell people all the time as a race reporter, it may not be the best time to be a person of color in America, but it's a great time to be a journalist of color in America, because we have a lot of work to do. So, I feel, very proud of the work that a lot of my colleagues are doing, because, there are people who are going to be coming behind us generations and generations from now, who are going to read what we wrote and watch what we reported on television and listen to our radio dispatches, and that's going to be the way that they know what happened. And if we didn't tell the truth about what happened, then they're going to have a less accurate picture of what this moment was, and we're not around to tell them, so that's the only way they're going to know.
So you mentioned earlier there's a split in this business. There's legacy media and new media, but it's someone who started one of the first blogs at the New York Times. You bridge the gap. Is there a difference in the way that new media and legacy media approach this notion of diversity and hearing from all voices?
There are some distinctions, I think, but they may actually not be as great as they first appear. We all know that legacy newsrooms have struggled with the challenge of diversity. They've also, those struggles are associated, I would argue, with the challenging economic environment. Readers are migrating from print toward online. That could be a whole topic of a separate discussion. But it has, the challenging economic times for legacy news organizations have made it harder to diversify newsrooms. But in a sense, there's a great convergence right now too, because the old divisions between print and broadcast, between online and print, some of them seem to be actually fading more and more. I want to go back a little bit to what just a moment ago about the immensity of this time. Sure. I think how we sort of live up to the moment right now depends on whether we preserve journalism's values. Yeah. And people are going to have different ways of doing that. There are definitely some who would prefer that journalists take a more activist, confrontational, deeply adversarial stance toward power. Which
More so now?
More so now, just because we're in a very, very politically fraught and very polarized environment. And I think it is important that we be skeptical of and a check on power. I also choose to believe that, we as journalists, or speaking for myself, shouldn't be the story. And that as much as possible, we should try to keep the energy and the attention focused on what we do best, which is document, chronicle, ask questions, interrogate power, dig up public records, talk to sources, be meticulous, be fair, stand up for journalism's highest values. That's the part that I try to stay centered around, so that we can make sure that we pass that when we're judged, because they will be reading our tweets, whether they were including those that were archived or deleted. They will be looking at what we said on these panel discussions, however they're digitally stored. And I think one question, hopefully, that people of the future will ask is, how did we respond as journalists to this moment? Did we stay true to the values of the First Amendment? Did we stand up for a free and independent press? Did we have the capacity to be introspective about what we do, but also be courageous and joyful about what we do?
You mentioned that this will be stored somewhere in all these conversations and the tweets and stuff. Has that limited our ability to have conversations now? Or are we all walking on pins and needles and afraid to be honest with...
Can I quickly say one thing? I was a little bit afraid to be on this panel even. Not because I'm fearful of this audience, of course not, but I think especially those of us in positions of leadership and management, we're being looked at. We're being looked at by our audiences, by our employees. You certainly, Lester, are, we were talking backstage about how, you're being scrutinized. You're more the story, quote unquote, even if you're not trying to be. And I know you're not trying to be, than before. People are going to watch you moderate a presidential debate. They're going to be Googling you and looking for any evidence of political bias, or who is this guy Lester Holt? Is he fair? Is he legit? People are going to be Googling all of us on stage and asking, who's Leon? What's going on here? What's the bent? What's the political angle and perspective? So we all have to be we have to be careful, and we have to be responsible. And I don't think that means avoid public engagement. What I do think it means is that we have to choose our words carefully. We have to, be respectful and responsible, and we have to avoid a rush to kind of judgment, which is hard in an age of kind of instantaneous, 24/7, second by second kind of, communications. How do we keep true to our true north? How do we, try to manage to be thoughtful and reflective, even as we're trying to be urgent and speedy?
Right. Yeah.
Marina, do you want to weigh in?
I just wanted to say something that. In the populist playbook, right at the top of that playbook is turn independent journalists into opposition media. And do that by attacking them, by pursuing them, by harassing them, undermine their work. And you know what? It's easy, and we have seen it in other countries, to fall into that trap, to feel so victimized and so ostracized that then we become kind of, we fulfill that that goal that the populist has, or like or a dictator or whatever. And journalists even start identifying themselves. They say, I am from like the opposition newspaper, so and so. And I'm like, what is an opposition newspaper? Like, no, you are a journalist.
Right.
So in these trying times, we have to, more than ever, like Sewell said, work harder and go back to our foundational principles of fact-checking and sound reporting and being in the community more than ever, and resist the temptations to like, raise this flag of victim or opposition, because that just that's what they're looking for.
Yeah.
And that's when they can honestly say maybe that we are fake journalists if we do that.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. And I will say, because I do have a more sizable Twitter following, especially since I started covering politics, than I did before. And I view my Twitter account as an extension of of who I am as a journalist, right? So while I am going to still tweet about Cardi B every now and then, going to do that. You're going to see some of that. Welcome new followers. I'm tweeting about Cardi B and the election, but also I do make some conscious decisions about how I'm going to be, especially on Twitter. I do not tweet about the debates when the debates are happening. I'm covering the debate, but I do not live tweet that at all. Because again, it can give fuel to folks that are looking to kind of try to accuse me of bias or try to read anything into my coverage. And so I just, it's just best to avoid that. And I think, but that's not something that a lot of political journalists do, right? Because they want to be engaged in that Twitter community. My colleagues and I are constantly reminding each other, Twitter is not America, right? Like most people in America are not on Twitter.
Yeah.
Right? But Twitter is, I will also say, a place where I am finding a lot of voices that otherwise I may not find, that have thoughts and opinions and feelings on some of the things that I write about. And so, but for Twitter, I would not be able to find them necessarily as quickly all the time. Man on the street is not necessarily something you always have time to do in a 24/7 news cycle, right? But Twitter is a different kind of man on the street that I feel like has really, it can be, it can definitely be a toxic place, but it can also be a very useful place and useful in terms of finding some of those voices for sure.
Well, we've reached a point in our discussion. It's going to be less of me, and I'm going to read some of your questions that were submitted tonight and get the panel to weigh in on them. The first one here at the top of my list: how does coverage of the migrant crisis and the immigration issue depend on the media outlets? Leon, you want to take that?
Sure. I've seen coverage get better and better, and that that makes me even emotional, Lester, to be honest with you. At the beginning of this period, in 2015, when Donald Trump announced his candidacy, and he described Mexicans as rapists and thieves and whatnot, and he focused on immigration. The number of outlets that took that as a call to journalistic arms and began covering the topic with depth and seriousness was, the number was really small. I think that as time has gone by, like I described with the LA Times, and I could name a bunch more, thankfully, that has improved immensely. And I do think that when we look at nativism in the American political sphere, and if we want to combat nativism, the way to do it is, again, through reporting. The way the travel ban was finally, at least in public opinion, I think, defeated, was not through interviews with Democratic senators or Republican lawmakers. It was when we all decided to go to the airports and interview the grandmother who couldn't get to her grandkids, whatever, or the graduate student from Iran who couldn't get to MIT, when we realized the social cost of this horrendous dynamic, these horrendous measures. And I think that's what's happening now very clearly with immigration. Again, quickly, I go back to the way that English language media has been covering the consequences of MPP, of Remain in Mexico. You can see it everywhere. Just in the last 48 hours, I read 4 brilliant, heartbreaking, beautifully, deeply reported pieces on the situation going on in Tijuana, Ciudad Juárez, Matamoros, places that many people, and by people I mean journalists, had never visited before. And I'm very grateful, actually. I just want to say I'm happy, I'm thrilled. No, but I'm very grateful, frankly, as a journalist, and also as a Hispanic journalist, and also as a Mexican, that this dynamic has changed, and now the story is being told, because that's really the way to combat this nativist wave and ignorance, which is one of the ills of our time.
But you know what, Leon? You shouldn't have to be grateful, because this is an American story. Like when we look at the end of this year, when we look at the headlines of 2019, immigration is right up there in the top 10 stories of this year in terms of what we covered and prioritized as a major issue that happened in America, right? And I mean, we know that the story of America is a story of immigration. And so, you know, the thought that news outlets have come to the understanding that, hey, this is, again, not just a moral imperative, but it is an economic imperative for me to care about this, for me to understand this, and for me to be down at the border covering this. I take your point that it is a good thing in progress for the industry that is happening, but it is something that definitely should be happening.
Well, I don't know if I mean, of course, I could also say that I should demand this coverage.
No.
But you know, I am grateful in many ways, and I also applaud the networks, for example, for realizing that this is indeed an American story. I think of my colleague Maria Elena Salinas, yes, formerly with Univision, who is now with CBS News. She's there in the mornings and was right there interviewing migrant families affected by these raids in Mississippi, the way detention centers have been covered. It is an American story. It certainly is. It has always been an American story, but it not always has been covered as such. Absolutely. And now I'm very happy that I finally said happy, that it is being covered that way. I am happy. What can I say?
Another question, and I'll throw this out to anyone on the panel who wants to address it. What is the biggest threat to free press today? Want to take a shot at that?
The erosion of trust.
Mm-hmm. The erosion of trust.
In our institutions, in each other, and in the values of democracy. It is by no means a battle that has been lost, but it is it's under threat. If we don't trust in each other, we can't trust our institutions, can't trust our news outlets, can't trust our leaders, it's not going to end well. Mm-hmm. But if we can restore trust by being authentic and transparent and precise and values-based, then we have a shot.
Mm-hmm. Let me just follow up to that. To the extent that reporters are seen sometimes as pundits, is that detrimental to that trust?
Yes. I mean, well, just because there are a lot more of us, I will speak as a print journalist, there are a lot more of us that are on cable news now. That's not necessarily a distinction that viewers are making all the time, right? Like they are seeing, you know, 4 people sitting up on a panel. There's a journalist. There's, you know, somebody else is talking about politics. It's maybe not a journalist. There's an academic. You know, they're not necessarily distinguishing between all of us. They just see 4 smart people, you know, talking about, you know, whatever the topic of the day is. And so I think that maybe confuses people. But again, to Sewell's point, like it's very important for us to, you know, stick to our values and who we are, because I think that increasingly, especially with social media, what you do have is not only folks who are gravitating to news outlets that they trust, but to journalists that they trust. And Lester, you would certainly be an example of that, you know, to my mind.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask you exactly that. You anchor the most important newscast in America. How do you deal with this issue of the loss of trust?
Hi, moderator.
It is, you know, it's, how did the tables get turned here?
Leon pulled out the table on
you. You sit with a stage full of journalists is what you get.
The table is out, and Lester, you are on.
No, you know, I have the privilege of anchoring a broadcast that has a 75-year legacy. And as corny as that may sound, that's in the back of your mind when you do it every night. You know that these 3 evening shows are appointment viewing for millions of Americans. We hear the stories of declining audiences, and yes, all television audiences are declining, but still, you know, 22, 23, 24 million people watching those 3 broadcasts every night. So there's a huge responsibility. And we hold ourselves to a higher standard, and that's not to say we're better than, because I happen to enjoy the spirited, provocative conversations on cable TV. That's not what we do on nightly news. It's important for us to kind of, tell you what we know. But I'll tell you this though, and I get asked this question a lot. I remind people that television news or news in general isn't supposed to make you happy all the time. Sometimes it's going to make you mad because we're going to report something that is going to change your worldview or challenge your worldview or suggest that maybe, things aren't quite as you thought they were. And, as I always say, you're going to want to throw the shoe at the TV. Please don't. But that's the reality. And I think it's important for all of us to remind ourselves, because we are in businesses that depend on, viewership or readership and different metrics. But at the same time, we have got to be true to our mission. And that's to report the truth and to try and put things in perspective every day. But it is a challenge. And I think to your point, Sewell, I think trust is the threat to freedom of the press. If we lose that, if we let the critics have a louder voice, and I think, well, you got me going now. And I think one of the other challenges we face right now is what extent do we defend ourselves as journalists, because it's not in our nature, because we want our work to speak for who we are and what we do. And I think that's something we all wrestle with. At what point do you say, no, that's not the case, and take off the gloves?
And not to, in my view at least, it's not to punch back. It's to argue that, journalists have to do a better job. I think that's one reason we're all here tonight. We have to do a better job articulating, explaining, and contextualizing the history of journalism and journalistic values. Mm-hmm. We have to make the case for why fair journalism matters. We can't assume anymore that people will be like, oh, well, okay, it's NBC or it's Univision or it's the Associated Press, therefore it is trusted. We've got to do a better job of being transparent about our methods, transparent about who we are as individuals. I'm actually kind of hopeful, though. I remember the old line that said, who can fill the role that Cronkite played or that an Ed Murrow played? And I think I know the answer tonight. It's Lester Holt.
May I add just something?
Please, yeah.
I just wanted to quote Kathleen from CPJ, who on Monday said something very, very true, that in her view, the biggest threat to freedom of the press is the collapse of the media business model, because there is no trust in media if there's no media. And when we have vast parts of the country that have no media, we have a problem, and we're trying to solve it. We haven't solved it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank this terrific panel. This has been a great discussion. You creeped me out. Are we in trouble? No, I'm worrying about people recording. I'm making a joke. It's okay.
I hope not.
It's okay. No, it's been a great discussion, and I'm proud to share the stage with all of you. Thank you so much for being a part of this. I'd like to bring up the Hollywood Foreign Press Association for final words and thank them for supporting LA Press Freedom Week. Sam Ossie is a film journalist, a TV producer and host as the Hollywood correspondent for BBC World Service Arabic. He's also a member of the Hollywood Foreign Press Association. I'd like to invite him up now.
Thank you all for coming. This is a very impressive turnout. May I steal your water? I had some hummus, and trust me, I'm a Palestinian. Hummus gets really thirsty. We invented it. Okay. I have a beautiful speech, but since in the last 24 hours, there were elections in Israel. And since I'm a citizen of Israel, I don't know if you heard about the news, but the Israeli Arab Party won 13 mandates. That's the third largest party. But none of the competing big candidates is willing to be a partner of this party. Ironically, when I watch the news, no one brings members from that third largest party to interview them and listen to their perspective. I'm just talking about diversity. And no one in the media is concerned by the fact that the largest party is not being accepted simply because of their ethnicity. I wanted to put that in context, because that's what I'm going to talk about, because diversity is a personal issue for me. Because growing up as an Israeli Palestinian, I recall being frustrated by the misrepresentation of who I am in the Western media. I always wondered why guys sitting in London and Washington were presenting my perspective to the world. And when I moved to the West, I had to endure those horrific consequences of those reports. On many occasions, I was called a terrorist, or many unseemly adjectives, not by the uneducated, but rather by fellow liberals, often members of the media, who report the news. I initially thought it was all driven by hatred and malice. It was not. These people have been conditioned to years of negative stereotypes about others, and so unconsciously associate a certain group with those particular characteristics. We all possess these implicit biases because our brain is designed to focus on a fraction of information we receive and leave the rest to the automatic, preconceived associations which lead to the desperate treatment of others. For example, one study at the University of Alabama found that terror attacks committed by Muslims received 357% more coverage than attacks committed by others. This kind of repeated reinforcement of ideas plants the seed of this implicit bias. So after 3 years of working as a neuroscientist at the University College London, I decided to leave that promising career in medicine and leap into this uncertain world of the media, hoping to make a change. Soon I realized that there was one dominant perspective about me in the Western media, and that has become the mainstream. And anything else was considered either extreme or irrelevant. Ironically, to the Arab media, I was too westernized or Israelized. But they opened their doors when I convinced them that I was one of them. But I didn't want to just preach to the choir, so I kept trying until 7 years ago. I was able to enter the pinnacle of Western media, the BBC. Now, the BBC is justly considered the champion of diversity. 15% of its employees are indeed from ethnic minorities. Yet, even there, all the editors and the executives I have dealt with at BBC News, English and World, were white, who, like decision makers from other organizations I worked for, often treated me with doubt, suspicion, or mistrust, while peoples of color within the BBC and others embraced me and supported me and praised my work and promoted me. One BBC News editor, who has become a friend of mine, told me that he was trepidatious about connecting with me because he had never met a Palestinian. Seriously, he was so nervous the first time we sat together. Another editor who wanted to meet me, take stories from me, but when she realized that I was Palestinian, she said, "Do you mind giving your stories to one of our reporters, a white reporter?" And then she said, "Don't worry, my dear, I'll pay you exactly as much as I pay him." I said, "Thank you," and moved on. Well, this culture is pervasive also in the entertainment industry. I recall asking a well-known liberal producer, that's in England, who made a film about a Muslim woman. It's called Yasmin, 2003. I asked her why she hired a white director and a white writer to tell the story. Why not Muslims? She responded in front of a crowd like yours, "I don't trust them." And this is a very liberal lady. I respect her, actually. I like her. These editors and producers form their views about others from their embedded, implicit biases rather than personal experiences. And by failing to recognize those unconscious prejudices, they are unwittingly reinforcing them among their audiences. Furthermore, when they make decisions and speak on behalf of other ethnicities, they perpetuate the notion that people of color lack the intellectual capacity to speak for themselves. So they are inadvertently feeding the racism they are trying to stem. As long as the masses don't see diverse faces or hear diverse voices, I think that the media will remain a barrier that keeps us apart instead of being a bridge that brings us together. To change that, we need diversity in faith, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation among decision makers, not employees. Otherwise, we will continue to get more Trumps, Brexits, and populist regimes around the world. Finally, I would like to thank you on behalf of the HFPA. I would like to thank our panelists, Sewell Chan, Marina Walker Guevara, Leon Krauze, Errin, Haines, for enlightening us with your knowledge and wisdom. Thank you. And you, Lester, I haven't forgot you. And you, Lester, for navigating this fascinating conversation. Thank you all. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you in the next one.